The unexpected visitor. The jungle stretched endlessly, a thick, tangled web of green and brown, where the air was thick with humidity, and the distant sounds of strange creatures echoed through the trees. This was no ordinary place. To most, it was a deadly, hostile environment. But to Lyra, the alien girl who had been trapped here for what seemed like an eternity, it had become her only home. Lyra had been captured by the Zorn, a ruthless alien species who collected beings from various planets for their dark experiments. Her people, the Vexi, had always been explorers and peaceful traders, never accustomed to the brutalities of war. But everything changed when the Zorn attacked, leaving nothing but ruins of her once vibrant homeworld. Lyra had been taken as a specimen, a living trophy to be studied. They told her she was one of the last of her kind, the last Vexi, a species now reduced to a memory, and that she'd never return to her home. But Lyra wasn't ready to accept that. She wasn't ready to let the story of her people fade into oblivion. Every day, she fought to survive, using her wits to outsmart the guards that held her in captivity. The Zorn's prison, a towering metallic fortress surrounded by thick, hostile forests, was meant to break her spirit. But it didn't. It made her stronger. It gave her resolve. Lyra had escaped countless times. She knew the terrain better than the guards did, having learned to navigate the dense jungle with stealth and precision. But every time she was caught and dragged back into her cell, she felt a tiny piece of hope die inside her. Still, she kept fighting. For the memory of her people. For the possibility of freedom. It was the middle of another muggy afternoon when it happened. The ground shook, and the air seemed to ripple with tension. Lyra had been pacing inside her cell when she heard the unmistakable hum of a ship. At first, she thought it was one of the Zorn's transports, but this sound was different. It was familiar, almost comforting in its hum. It was a noise she hadn't heard in a long time. She pressed her face to the cold, metal bars of her prison, squinting into the distance. A ship, no, a human ship, was descending through the thick canopy of the jungle. Her heart skipped a beat. A human. She had heard of them. The legends whispered among the Zorn, of a fierce species that had once driven them back. But she had never believed the stories. And now, here they were. The ship touched down with a soft thud. And for a moment, everything went quiet. Lyra's mind raced. She had heard of humans. Fearless warriors, clever inventors, and beings who fought with an unyielding spirit. The Zorn had always treated them as a threat, but Lyra had never seen them for herself. She had always thought of them as a myth, a fairy tale told to keep prisoners in line. But now it seemed they were real, and they had come for her. With a newfound sense of urgency, Lyra pushed aside the dark thoughts of her past. She had to act quickly. The Zorn would be on high alert now. If they found out what had just happened, they'd surely tighten security. She glanced around her cell, her sharp mind already formulating a plan. She'd had enough of being a prisoner. It was time to see if the legends about humans were true. The sound of boots crunching on the jungle floor reached her ears, and she tensed. She had no idea who these humans were, or if they were even here to help her. But they had come, and that was enough for now. She couldn't let this opportunity slip away. Lyra waited, holding her breath as the footsteps grew closer. She reached into her pocket, feeling the small device that had been her only companion in this hellish world. A stolen Zorn communicator. It wasn't much, but it had allowed her to keep track of the prison's layout and the movements of the guards. She was just about to start planning her next escape when she heard a voice, a deep, commanding voice. "Hello. Anyone here?" The voice called out, slightly muffled by the thick jungle air. Lyra froze. The voice was unlike any of the Zorn guards. It was rough, yet oddly comforting, as though the speaker wasn't here to harm her. She didn't know how to explain it. But in that moment, she knew the person on the other side of the jungle was different. She had to take the chance. If they were here to rescue her, she would find a way to trust them. She could no longer remain in her cage. The thought of spending another moment in captivity was unbearable. Lyra moved toward the edge of her cell, peering through the bars. She saw him then, a tall, broad figure emerging from the shadows. He was unlike any being she had ever seen before. His skin was pale, his hair short and dark, and his eyes gleamed with an intensity she hadn't expected. This was no ordinary human. He was strong, but there was a kindness in his gaze that set him apart from the monsters she had known. His features were rugged, battle-worn, but there was something else about him that she couldn't quite put her finger on, something deep and resilient. His eyes scanned the area, and for a moment, their gazes locked. A silent understanding passed between them. He was here for her, and she was ready to be free. Without a moment's hesitation, Lyra reached out, pressing the small button on her communicator to override the door's lock. The metal door creaked open, revealing the human standing just a few feet away. His eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't draw a weapon. He stood still, studying her. "Are you real?" Lyra asked, her voice cracking from disuse. The man blinked, then smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to ease the tension in her chest. "I'm real, and I'm here to help." Lyra could hardly believe it. A human, here to rescue her. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax. Maybe, just maybe, she could escape this nightmare. She stepped out of her cage, cautiously at first, then with more confidence. "We need to go," the human said, his voice calm yet urgent. "They'll be looking for you soon." Lyra nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. With this human by her side, maybe she could finally escape. Maybe she could find a way back to her people. With her hand on the human's shoulder for guidance, Lyra took the first steps toward the unknown, leaving the prison behind. The jungle seemed less intimidating now, the air lighter, the trees less oppressive. She was free. For the first time, she believed it. The jungle was full of dangers, but she was no longer alone, and that made all the difference. A dangerous alliance. The jungle was thick with tension, and every shadow seemed to conceal an unseen danger. Lyra followed the human, who had introduced himself as Dorian, through the dense underbrush, her senses on high alert. The sounds of strange creatures echoed around them, the air thick with humidity and the scent of earth and decay. She had lived in this jungle for so long, but now, with the human at her side, it felt different, less oppressive, less suffocating. Dorian was a tall, broad-shouldered man with short, dark hair that matched the rugged look of his weathered clothes. He had a quiet confidence about him, moving with purpose yet without haste, as though he knew exactly where he was going. Despite his obvious strength and experience, there was something almost gentle in the way he carried himself, as if he wasn't just here for a mission, but for something much more important. It intrigued Lyra, though she had learned to be cautious. Trust had been a luxury she could no longer afford, especially in a place as dangerous as this jungle. "I hope you know where we're going," Lyra said, her voice low as she kept pace with him. She had been trained in survival tactics, an expert in navigating hostile environments, but she didn't know this human. For all she knew, he could be leading her into a trap. Dorian glanced back at her, his lips curling into a smile. "Trust me, I've been here before," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "I know where the exit is." Lyra didn't respond immediately. Her mind raced. An exit. There were several exit points from the jungle, but all were heavily guarded by the Zorn, or filled with dangerous creatures. Could this human truly know the way out? Could she trust him? She glanced at Dorian again, her sharp eyes scanning his face for any sign of deceit. There was none. His eyes, though wary, were steady. He wasn't lying. "I've fought the Zorn before," Dorian continued, noticing her skeptical gaze. "And I've been to worse places than this. This jungle isn't the end of the world, Lyra. It's just another challenge." The sound of his voice soothed something deep inside her. It was true. Lyra had faced challenges that no one should ever have to face. She had survived impossible odds, escaping from Zorn facilities, eluding their traps, and navigating treacherous environments. The Zorn were cruel, but they were predictable. They had their patterns, their routines, and now, with this human by her side, she could feel her own confidence growing, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely alone in this fight. But they weren't alone in the jungle. The first attack came suddenly, a rustling sound in the thick foliage just ahead of them. Without warning, a massive creature leaped from the shadows, its yellow eyes gleaming with hunger. It was a beast, part reptile, part insect, with large, sharp pincers and claws that could tear through flesh in seconds. The creature hissed, showing rows of jagged teeth as it charged at them, its long tail whipping through the air. Lyra froze for a split second, the fear rushing back. She had encountered these creatures before. They were known as screeve, massive jungle predators with venomous bites and a deadly grip. The Zorn used them as hunters, training them to track and capture prisoners. Lyra had barely escaped one of them once. She didn't have the luxury of hesitation. Without thinking, she reached for her weapon, an energy blade, a tool she had scavenged from a Zorn guard. It wasn't much, but it had been her only form of defense for years. As the screeve bore down on them, Lyra leaped into action, swinging the blade at the creature's snapping jaws. The energy blade glowed brightly, slicing through the air as it made contact with the beast's arm, sending sparks flying. The screeve recoiled, screeching in pain, but it didn't stop. Dorian reacted just as quickly. He reached for a strange-looking device on his belt and flicked a switch. The next thing Lyra saw was a burst of light, a flash of green energy as Dorian's weapon fired, striking the screeve directly in the chest. The creature let out a deafening roar before collapsing to the ground, motionless. Lyra stood there, breathing heavily, her eyes fixed on the fallen beast. She had faced countless threats in this jungle, but that had been different. Dorian hadn't hesitated. He had known exactly what to do, and he had saved her life. She turned to face him, her heart pounding. You knew that was coming, didn't you?" she asked, her voice a mix of awe and suspicion. Dorian looked down at his weapon, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't know exactly, but I've been in enough fights to recognize the signs. The screeve are territorial. When one comes at you like that, it means the others aren't far behind." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "You're not just some random traveler, are you? You're a warrior." Dorian paused, then gave a small shrug. "You could say that. I've fought in my share of wars, been on both sides of the battle. But what I've learned is that the best way to fight is to be prepared. Expect the unexpected." Lyra watched him closely. His words resonated with her. Fighting was never about just being strong. It was about understanding the world around you, adapting to it, and using everything at your disposal. She had been surviving in this jungle for so long, but there was something different about Dorian, something that made her wonder if she could trust him completely. For a moment, the two of them just stood there, their breaths coming in steady rhythms. The jungle around them had fallen silent once more, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind through the leaves. Lyra couldn't remember the last time she had felt this sense of peace, even in a place as dangerous as this, with the human by her side. It seemed like they could face anything. "We should keep moving," Dorian said, breaking the silence. "This isn't the safest place to linger." Lyra nodded, her gaze drifting from the dead screeve to the path ahead. "Agreed." They moved forward, but the jungle felt less suffocating now. Lyra could hear the distant calls of exotic creatures, but they no longer sounded like a threat. For the first time in years, Lyra felt the weight of her past begin to lift. She had been alone for so long, believing that no one could understand what she had been through, that no one could help her. But Dorian had come, a strange, unexpected ally, and for the first time in her life, Lyra felt as though there was someone who could see her, someone who understood. As they ventured deeper into the jungle, Lyra began to think about what might lie ahead. She didn't know where Dorian was taking her, or if the journey would lead them to safety or more danger. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hope rising within her, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to embrace in years. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe that was the most powerful thing of all. The price of freedom. The dense jungle canopy above them whispered with the rustling of unseen creatures, and the air was thick with the humid scent of moss and decay. Lyra's heart still raced from the encounter with the screeve, but the adrenaline had slowly started to subside. The jungle felt quieter now, almost too quiet. Yet, despite the ominous stillness, there was a strange calmness between her and Dorian. They moved in tandem, their footsteps soft against the forest floor as they navigated the undergrowth. Lyra kept her senses sharp, watching the shifting shadows around them. Her instincts told her the danger was far from over, but Dorian seemed unbothered. Every now and then, he would glance over at her, his eyes scanning the area with a quiet confidence. He was at ease here, something that both comforted and confused her. He wasn't like the Zorn or the other invaders who had come to her world. He seemed different. Human, yes, but there was a quiet intensity about him, a strength that wasn't just physical. Lyra couldn't help but be drawn to him, despite her reservations. There was something about him that felt familiar, like a memory she couldn't place. She had never been this close to a human before, and yet there was something oddly comforting about his presence. "You never told me how you ended up here," Lyra said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice, though quiet, was laced with curiosity. Dorian glanced back at her, a flicker of something dark crossing his face, before he quickly masked it. "It's a long story," he said, his tone steady but distant. "A story I'd rather not share right now." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "I'm not asking for all the details, just a few pieces. How did you know about the Zorn? What are you really doing here?" Dorian stopped in his tracks, turning to face her. His expression softened, but his eyes were still shadowed with the weight of something unsaid. He looked at her for a long moment before exhaling slowly. "I'm not here by chance, Lyra," he began, his voice quieter now. "I've been tracking the Zorn for years. I've fought them before, been to their homeworld. I was sent to stop them from spreading their tyranny further." Lyra blinked, her confusion growing. Sent by who? He hesitated, his gaze flickering briefly to the sky before returning to her. "Does it really matter? What matters is that I've been hunting them down for a long time. I won't rest until they pay for what they've done." Lyra could see the anger in his eyes now, the fire that burned deep within him. It wasn't just a sense of duty that drove him. There was something personal behind it. She could almost feel the weight of his past pressing against her, but she didn't push further. Not yet. There was too much danger around them, too many unknowns. They had to keep moving. "All right," Lyra said, her voice firm but understanding. "But you should know this isn't the easiest place to escape from. We're not out of the woods yet." Dorian nodded. "I'm aware. That's why I need you to trust me. We're going to need each other if we're going to make it out of here alive." Lyra couldn't argue with that. She had been alone for far too long to deny the truth of his words. It was clear that her survival skills were sharp, but she also knew that she couldn't keep running forever. The Zorn would catch up, and when they did, she would be dead. As the day wore on, Lyra and Dorian continued their trek through the jungle, staying low and moving swiftly through the dense foliage. They had no destination in mind, just the hope that the further they went, the harder it would be for the Zorn to track them. But Lyra's heart still gnawed with worry. There was something unsettling about the way the jungle felt now. It was as if they were being washed. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the jungle floor, they had come to a stop at the edge of a small clearing. Lyra crouched down to rest, her senses alert as she scanned their surroundings. Dorian, meanwhile, had been fidgeting with some of the devices on his belt. "What is that thing?" Lyra asked, her voice low. Dorian looked up from his gadgets and smiled faintly. Just something to help me track signals. We'll need it if we're going to get out of here. Lyra studied him for a moment, then nodded. We're not safe yet. The Zorn could be close. They know how to track people through the jungle. Dorian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood up and began to scan the area. I know, he said finally, his voice tense. But we need to keep moving. There's no time to waste. Lyra stood as well, brushing the dirt off her clothes. So, what's the plan now? How do we get out of this place? Dorian turned to her, his face serious. We need to find one of the old Zorn escape routes. I've located a few of their old facilities nearby. They'll have transportation off this world. It's our best chance. Lyra's heart leaped at the thought of leaving, but something about the urgency in Dorian's voice unsettled her. She could tell this wasn't going to be an easy escape. There was more at stake here than just getting away from the Zorn. But if the human believed they could make it, then perhaps there was a glimmer of hope. Let's go then, Lyra said, determination flooding her veins. I'm not staying in this jungle for another day. Dorian nodded, his expression hardening. Good. We move now. If we're going to make it, we need to stay one step ahead of them. No mistakes. The two of them began to move again, heading deeper into the jungle. As they walked, Lyra couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The Zorn were relentless, and they would stop at nothing to recapture her. She had learned it the hard way. And yet, in the back of her mind, a small part of her, something that had been buried for so long, felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they could do this. Maybe they could escape together. But no sooner had she thought that than she heard it, a distant roar, the unmistakable sound of something large crashing through the jungle. A creature, or something far worse. Lyra's hand immediately went to her weapon, her body tensing. We're not alone, she whispered, her eyes scanning the jungle around them. Dorian, too, had stopped. He turned to face her, his expression grave. Stay close. Whatever that is, we don't want to face it alone. A sense of dread filled the air, thick and palpable. Every rustle, every movement in the shadows could mean death. The jungle had a way of swallowing you whole, and it didn't care whether you were human or alien. Lyra felt a shiver run down her spine as the sound grew louder. Something massive was heading their way. Ready? Dorian asked, his voice steady despite the growing tension. Lyra nodded, her grip tightening on her energy blade. I was born ready. The jungle, it seemed, had one more test for them, and as the roar of the approaching creature grew closer, Lyra knew one thing for sure. The real battle was about to begin. The beast and the betrayal. The sounds of the jungle grew louder, more insistent, as the ground beneath Lyra's feet vibrated ever so slightly. The distant roar echoed again, closer now, and Lyra's pulse quickened. The creature, or whatever it was approaching at a frightening pace. There was no time to waste. Every instinct in her told her that they needed to act, and fast. Dorian, too, had become tense. He had drawn a strange, unfamiliar weapon from his belt, a gleaming blade that emitted a low humming sound. He was no stranger to danger, Lyra could tell, but she had never seen him look quite this serious before. His eyes scanned the jungle's dense foliage, every movement precise, every muscle coiled and ready. Do you have a plan? Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible as she crouched low, instinctively drawing her own energy blade. We need to get to higher ground, Dorian said, his voice taut with urgency. It's the only way we can get a good vantage point. We need to see what we're up against. Stay close. Lyra nodded and followed him as he darted through the undergrowth. The jungle, once a familiar terrain where Lyra had learned to blend in with the shadows, now seemed full of hidden threats. The air smelled sharp with danger, and the quiet hum of the weapon in Dorian's hand only added to the growing tension. They found a narrow path leading up the side of a rock formation, a steep incline surrounded by thick vines and dense leaves. As they ascended, Lyra's mind raced. What kind of creature could cause such a disturbance in the jungle? The roar they had heard was unlike any animal she had encountered before. It wasn't just a primal call, it was a warning. Once at the top of the incline, they crouched behind a thick bush, carefully peering through the leaves. Below them, the jungle seemed peaceful, but Lyra could feel the pulse of danger in the air. Her instincts screamed that the creature was close. And then she saw it. A hulking figure emerged from the shadows of the trees, its silhouette towering above the underbrush. It was massive, easily 20 feet tall, covered in thick scales that shimmered in the low light. The creature's eyes gleamed with a feral, bloodthirsty light as it sniffed the air, searching for something. Its claws scraped the ground, leaving deep gouges in the earth. The creature was a Varkor, a type of apex predator that the Zorn had brought to this planet. They were deadly, nearly indestructible, and had been used by the Zorn to hunt and track their enemies. It had been years since Lyra had last seen one, and the memories were enough to make her blood run cold. "Stay low," Dorian hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't fight it here." Lyra's hand tightened around her blade. "We won't have a choice if it finds us." Dorian glanced at her, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "Then we fight. But not here. Not now. We need to move." But before they could make another move, the Varkor's head snapped up, its nostrils flaring. It had caught their scent. Lyra's heart dropped. The creature was faster than she had expected, and she could already see the predatory gleam in its eyes as it began charging toward them. "Move," Dorian ordered, and without hesitation, Lyra followed him, darting down the path toward the dense jungle. They couldn't outrun the Varkor. It was built for speed and agility. But they had one advantage: the jungle itself. The Varkor was strong, but it wasn't as familiar with the terrain as they were. Lyra's feet pounded against the earth as she pushed herself harder, faster. She could hear the creature behind them, its massive feet thundering on the ground, but she dared not look back. Dorian was ahead of her, effortlessly weaving through the trees and vines, making it look easy. His presence in the jungle seemed almost natural, like he had been living here for years, not just a few days. Ahead, Lyra saw a small clearing. It wasn't much, but it was open, wide enough for them to make a stand. They couldn't run forever, and if they were going to fight, this was as good a place as any. "Over here," Lyra shouted to Dorian as she veered toward the clearing. She turned just in time to see the Varkor charging after them, its eyes fixed on her with terrifying precision. Dorian was already in position, his strange glowing blade raised high. Lyra took a deep breath, her energy blade crackling to life in her hand. She could feel the heat of it, the power thrumming in her veins. She had never been one to shy away from a fight. But this creature was unlike anything she had ever faced. As the Varkor lunged, its claws extended to strike. Dorian moved first. He was fast, so fast that Lyra almost didn't see him move. He swept his blade through the air in a blur, cutting across the Varkor's chest. The creature roared in pain, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it whipped around, its enormous tail swiping through the air, knocking Dorian off his feet and sending him crashing into the ground. Lyra's heart stopped. She had seen enough to know that the Varkor was a force of nature, unstoppable, lethal, and relentless. She couldn't afford to lose Dorian. Not now, not when they were so close to escape. Without thinking, Lyra surged forward, her energy blade raised. She wasn't going to let the Varkor take Dorian. She wasn't going to let this creature take everything from her. Not again. The blade cut through the air in a wide arc, slashing at the Varkor's tail. The creature hissed, its attention momentarily diverted, and that was all the time Lyra needed. She dove toward Dorian, who was struggling to get back to his feet. The jungle seemed to tilt as she moved, her world narrowing down to the sound of her heartbeat and the animalistic growls of the Varkor. Lyra reached Dorian just in time to help him up, but the Varkor wasn't far behind. Its eyes were wild with fury now, and it launched itself at them with terrifying speed. They had no time to dodge. "Hold on," Dorian shouted, pulling a strange device from his belt and slamming it to the ground. The air shimmered, and a sudden shockwave sent the Varker crashing backward. The creature screeched in frustration, but the force of the blast had thrown it off balance long enough for them to regroup. "What was that?" Lyra gasped, still reeling from the blast. "An EMP pulse," Dorian said, his breath heavy as he glanced over at her. "Just enough to disable its senses. For a minute, anyway." Lyra nodded, understanding. "Let's make it count." They didn't wait for the Varker to recover. The creature was already getting back to its feet, its fury mounting as it charged again. This time, they were ready. Together, Lyra and Dorian surged forward. Lyra used her energy blade to strike at the creature's side, and Dorian followed up with a brutal swipe to its face. The Varker roared in pain, but this time, it didn't have the strength to retaliate. Finally, with a decisive slash, Lyra drove her blade deep into the creature's chest. It let out a final screech before collapsing to the ground, its life extinguished. Breathing heavily, Lyra stepped back, her heart racing from the exertion. She turned to Dorian, who was still standing strong, his weapon lowered but ready. The fight had been intense, but they had won. For now. But as Lyra looked at the remains of the Varker, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't just about survival anymore. There was something deeper at play, something that neither she nor Dorian had fully realized yet, and the price of their freedom was going to be much higher than either of them had anticipated.